Thanks for downloading this episode of the BimTube podcast. Just a reminder that you can access all the podcasts in video and audio if you visit bim.tube. So our website again is at bim.tube. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the BimTube podcast. On this edition, we've got Stephen Steer. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, and obviously we've had a little chat before, but as just to remind people listening or watching, of course, in my mind, BIM means better information management, which of course we know full well it could mean lots of other things, but we're playing with it. So we obviously touch on topics around digital transformation and other related topics. So, Stephen, obviously we've met before, but for the benefit of those watching or listening, if you could please introduce yourself, that would be great. And also your journey about how you started your sort of academic career and how did you get to where you are today? That'd be really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So I suppose some of my, I'll perhaps start at the end. So some of my more prominent recent work has been focused on the energy sector, although I take an interest in infrastructures more widely. And in particular, I spend a lot of time focusing on the regulation of data and digital services, and so my previous role was as Ofgem's head of data. So I set a lot of the modern rules and requirements and expectations on licensed companies that operate in the energy market, who are the single sources of a lot of very interesting data to society. And that data historically hasn't been very widely available. And so we've put in a lot of effort in recent years to change that. I now work for a digital engineering consultancy company. They're called Zorka Engineering. But if we walk backwards to the past, my origins are in physics. So as a nuclear physicist, I worked at places like particle accelerator facilities. People who aren't familiar can think of things like CERN and that kind of facility. They're very data intensive environments. So I learned a lot of, I suppose, the technical trade there. But I had quite I don't quite want to call it meandering, but it probably was a bit of a meandering path in my early years of wider sort of skills that I developed, which had helped me get to the place where I could regulate markets. And in particular, I stayed in academia for a while. I was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge in a combined role across the engineering and economics department. I've also worked a lot in sort of the private sector as well, in analytical roles. And actually prior to the digital agenda at Ofgem, I spent a long time doing, if you like, the guts of regulatory work of what we call price controls for Ofgem. So policy, economics, physics, engineering, quite a blend.
That is quite a blend. I think it's interesting, your scientific background, obviously the rigor and the structure by definition in science, and then moving on to the regulatory. It's what I tend to find, just as an observation, is there isn't enough governance around information data. Now, you're the personification of working in a regulator, but just at a high level, what were some of the major challenges? I know it would have taken years to embed some of these things, but just at a high level for those sort of new to data management, data governance, what were some of the key challenges around trying to standardize the governance framework?
So, I mean, certainly the early days when I did feel rather unusual, given my background as someone who joined a policy-making department. They don't have any other physicists, that, at least any who'd progressed a career very far in physics. And so the way I would look at the problems was very different to the colleagues around me. And I found it's tempting to say a kind of where do you start situation where there wasn't recognition of how to assess whether there was a problem in the first instance. So data was in the realms of how we process spreadsheets and run the occasional database. But the idea of scale and the kind of things you see in the tech sector proper, of the mass scale use of information for entire business models, was for other people, I suppose. So there was an awfully long run-up period of acclimatizing people to the because data is always an enabler, it's never the end point of what you're seeking. There's a lot of effort required to help people understand what it could be doing, because it was quite alien to the local environment, the local professionals. So that was always very difficult to get the ball rolling in the first case, both internally to the organization and externally across the energy sector, actually.
So how, again, just again at a high level for maybe people that are new to this, how do you get the ball rolling? I mean, it might sound, I mean, you did it. I mean, you did it. I often have to talk hypothetically with people, but you've been through the journey. How did you get sort of initial buy-in?
Yeah, and I guess for clarity, and like, yes, I kind of did it. I was in the middle of it, but it's because you're dealing with sectoral level challenges. You're certainly not the only person doing it, right? So I suppose one of the first fundamentals is to start finding the like-minded people, because they do exist, and they're maybe not always obvious. And so I didn't do it alone by any stretch. And actually, fortunately, you can trace the lineage back to the Helm report. Actually, the Dieter Helm did a report on the energy sector in about, I think it came out in 2016-17, if memory serves. But yeah, it was quite a number of years going by, but you can at least see the seeds of when government had received serious recommendations about the top level concepts, but it took quite a number of years for it to be built up into action. I think that's where a lot of the pain points are. It's how do you make rapid progress? And actually, I mean, my experience is that digital and data solutions needed probably slightly different regulatory methods than those that had been traditionally used by organizations overseeing a sector. And I personally tried to apply a lot of different ways of doing things, which seems to have translated into accelerated progress. And
yeah, thanks, Stephen. Is this sort of on that theme of maybe getting initial buy-in or interest? Let's say it often does. Again, in my experience, for the benefit that people don't know, then I have an infrastructure background, more rail, and then other things. But energy, I've worked in energy, not as much as you. But it tends to be a report, like you said. There's the Helm report. Some things happened, whether it's an incident or a report. There's some kind of line in the sand, if you like, or something to create that impetus, and then it's hard to keep momentum. I often find was there any sort of use cases, they may be sensitive or otherwise, but any use cases or scenarios that you created to keep that momentum, like, oh, if we had this data managed better, then we could do this kind of analytics reporting? Or were there any sort of examples you gave early on?
I've always had quite mixed feelings about this one, actually. So there are definitely use cases, and you can get some really lovely complicated problems that aren't uniquely energy sector problems, actually. And like electric vehicles are really good for pulling on this tension of, we need to understand the state of the electricity grid and the state of the land system, if you like, if it's a system, as well as to understand ownership and permissions and such. We also need to know about the road networks, and suddenly you've got this kind of trivector problem of which sector does it sit in, and where do all the decisions can be. It gets very involved. So you get use cases like that of how do we make sure energy sector data is readily available for people who are doing cross-sectoral work like electric vehicles and such. But I do struggle sometimes in that quite a lot of digital and data solutions are themselves infrastructure, and they're often platforms that enable any given use case rather than just one use case. And so certainly in early days, I found it quite challenging to help people understand the ongoing value of establishing a kind of platform and infrastructure of capabilities, because a single use case was never alone enough to justify the investment as you wouldn't expect it to be. But yeah, there certainly are, and they're all the kind of normal consortium of things that are needed from the energy sector today about deploying renewables, electric vehicle uptake, the deployment of batteries, heat pumps for heat decarbonisation. There's a whole long list of different use cases.
Thanks, Stephen. Just for those that might not be familiar with, most people will be familiar with Ofcom, maybe not outside the UK, but what were the type of data sets that you were dealing with? Again, it may be self-evident, but it might not be to people. What were the data sets that you were gathering, and what were the typical use cases?
So within the regulator, Ofgem has probably somewhat different needs to quite a lot of market participants, actually. And I think one of the things that's quite a nice delineation is that it tends not to need so much, not live data in the sense that the industry would think about live data, which might be within, and it obviously depends on your role, but you can be interested in every second what's happening on the grid versus every day versus what's happening next week. It's, as a rule of thumb, the kinds of data the regulator is interested in are longer term in nature. Policy making in all kinds of walks of life take typically years to come about, occasionally months for smaller changes. And so regulatory work tends to be a bit more looking at batches of historic data rather than sort of live streamed information. I mean, you get a bit of live streaming, but not really. Again, the main focus is on longer term analyses. And so that might be about network infrastructure, so all the gas pipes, the electricity cables across the country, or the transformers and substations and the status and health of them. Might be about how often people are disconnected from networks, about whether people are getting, what types of tariffs are available on the market to end consumers, and the extent to which people are adopting them, or sects of society are not being included in them. But they tend to be longer term measures.
Okay, so strategic, not transactional. You personally wouldn't get involved in smart meter things that would be aggregated up in a strategic long term.
Typically, the closest you get is with the green policy schemes. Traditionally, these were things like renewables obligation or feed-in tariffs that got solar panels on people's rooftops, where Ofgem does provide some administrative services as well as regulatory services, and that's a bit more transactional.
Great, thank you. And just, I guess on a similar theme, but just moving forward, just around net zero and energy future work that you're doing more recently. Certainly, I'm not obsessed, but fascinated with, let's say, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and all these kind of things that, again, maybe some people haven't heard of them, but can you just explain some of the work you've been doing around net zero and how data and some of the insights you've been doing, how it feeds into the reports that you've been working on more recently?
Yeah, so this starts to tap in, I would argue, to some of my philosophies in life. And I suppose it's the regulatory work has been quite strongly informative to this, but I'm now incredibly interested. I mentioned at the start, like, policy, engineering, economics and physics all blended together. I think there's some really interesting societal challenges in relation to digital and data monopolies. There are many different monopolies in life, but digital and data ones are the trending among monopolies in my mind. They're a relatively new feature for society. You can go back 20 or 30 years, and they probably did exist prior to that, but they were probably analog data monopolies rather than digital data monopolies back then. And this is where I spend a lot of time thinking, and a lot of the work that we did regulatory-wise, a lot of the work I've done on other projects since, is often around that mantle of what do you do when there's only one organization who can provide a source of data that lots of people need. And it raises a lot of interesting economic questions about, when do you let free market forces loose? When do you only have a single organization, public or privately owned? I'm not very interested in public or private ownership. I just and how do you make sure that those, what I think of as what I call in my head, the economic core, the stuff that sits underneath the parts of the economy you have a choice over, how do you make sure that's running efficiently, the kind of frame that underpins the UK's overall economic system? So I spent a lot of time designing governance solutions that make sure those digital and data monopolies are operating efficiently, which is quite an abstract challenge, which I'm sure not many people think about in their day-to-day life.
Yeah, maybe or not. I mean, interestingly, I've been working with the World Bank and some economists around the value of data, so maybe we'll come back to that. That's but I was just thinking about, when you mentioned monopoly, I was thinking, how about the concept of a public good? Now, this has come up on a few other podcasts around open data.
Yeah.
What's your take on, should there be a monopoly in the first place? I mean, I don't want to sort of get you into maybe any political areas you don't want to discuss here, but what's your thought about that? I mean, I know there's a big thrust through the ODI, Open Data Institute, for data to be a public good. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, plenty, I suppose. And it doesn't get especially political, at least I don't view it that way. So I don't think monopolies are inherently a bad thing. I think the interesting, what I'd call the kind of fundamentals of economics side of it is learning what is the natural size of monopolies and being comfortable with the fact that that is not a static answer and it changes over the course of human history. And this starts to point to what I think of as the engineering aspects of an economy. I like to think of the economy from an engineer's perspective. So what's the right size today for our monopolies, and when should we adjust and adapt and change them? And I'll stop myself from going into too much detail on it. But I think natural monopolies should exist. It's the best thing to do. And you can argue over ownership models, but the natural monopoly needs to exist. And should their data be open and be in the public good? Well, I wrote something which is called Ofgem's Data Best Practice Guidance. It's a set of regulations, and it covers a lot of topics around this theme. And in those, I explicitly wrote rules that said that the public interest was the language we used in the guidance, but the public interest needs to be one of the considerations. And among the set of principles that the guidance is, there is a principle that requires energy network data to be what we call presumed open, which just means that by default, we're going to share this with anyone who wants it, unless we as the organization responsible for the data can evidence a good reason why not. And the interesting thing is that it's not a black and white decision, and the guidance goes further and says that you can't just say no, even if you've got evidence. You have to tell me what the minimum number of changes you could make to that data are so that you can publish something that has been desensitized for public consumption. And that's what I consider to be really quite progressive and is instigating a lot of investment in the sector and genuinely leading to data being opened up, which there's lots of really cool evidence these days to show those network companies standing up their open data portals and publishing data through it every day.
It's really interesting. The point there, you said it's not a binary decision, for the no pun intended, to release the data or not, because that other than that work, I haven't heard that. That doesn't often come up. It's just, traditionally it's just a no because it's sensitive.
Yeah.
But you might get redaction, and then you can argue that's not. Yeah. But that's really interesting, that part.
We had some really very strong rules on that front because I think that gets progress. And so the answer, so I like these logical extremes, right? If I've got the most sensitive data in the world, whatever it might be, and I just edit and replace every value in that data set with a number one, I've now got a completely desensitized data set about the most sensitive data in the world, and I could publish it. I mean, it doesn't help anybody. It's lost all of its utility, but it's publishable. And so you get this, the sliding scale is the tension between sensitivity versus utility. And if you have a discussion around the sliding scale where the answer is never no, it's where are we on the scale, then suddenly everything is publishable. You've just got to work out how publishable.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess there might be some knee-jerk reaction from some people, and I guess that's where the conversation comes in. It's say, well, how sensitive is this? And I think the challenge is that people have not been exposed to the concept of sensitive data in the past. Of course, this is like working for Ofgem with critical national infrastructure at the heart of it. There's always going to be sensitive data, so you're familiar with that conversation from the off. I think the challenge comes where some people have just never been used to sharing data at all.
Yeah, it takes a lot of, and I said at the start about the on-ramp to getting to the point of making progress. Well, this is a nice little example of the kinds of challenges that you face at expressing what you're trying to accomplish. And I think an interesting thing as well about how we went about delivering, because I mentioned a bit about how at the start, but I didn't explain myself. We didn't just lay out a set of principles that say, you need to go and do this. We accompanied a handful of page document that was the regulations with a 100-page document that said, here's some examples and techniques for how we think you can meet these requirements. You don't have to do what we're saying, but we're going to demystify what we mean by accomplishing and meeting these principles. So we gave examples where we desensitized data that had a degree of sensitivity in it to show that it's possible, show by doing, really, which is often the mantra of any digital and data professional.
I think the part that you've just added there, actually implementation examples, is where
yes, it's really important, right? If abstract concepts, you need to show what you actually mean, and it forces you to be specific. Something that generally blocks, especially macro level sector-wide initiatives, is that on the data front, or in any front probably, is the lack of specificity means that everyone's imagining something different to one another around them. But those worked examples allow everyone to solve loads of tiny specific problems and agree on them, rather than worrying about something that's too big to solve.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Often I'll be talking about standards perhaps in sort of parallel sectors, but nevertheless, ultimately the standards are a PDF document, and it's the what's missing is that example. Like you're saying, you went that extra mile. You and your colleagues gave the examples.
So, I mean, I don't know, I'm railroading you a little bit here, but that points to one of my other kind of big, I suppose, thought pieces, where I think there's a really valuable distinction between sort of digital engineering of the things that we have decided to do, and the decision-making process of what we should do. And actually that needs digital engineering too. You pointed to an example where I consider quite a modern state of affairs. So if we go back over the last 20 or 30 years, we've gone from, I'll pick on government, but it applies elsewhere. Government used to drop consultations to engage everybody in public libraries, and you would read about the consultation in newspapers in a nice analog format, and you would have to physically go and get it. And obviously technology's moved on. We all take it for granted that all UK consultations are on a website. You can go read the PDF document, but that's not the end of a chain. And actually PDFs have made progress and websites have made progress, but actually it's moving on again, and you need to start providing the Git repo, the data set that you based your information on. It's a lot of where academia's gone, and that it's further ramping up the expectations on transparency and opening up information that allows good quality governance to take place before you even begin engineering the solution. That just helps you decide what to engineer.
You remind me of the sort of moving into open data more broadly here, of data.gov.uk. I assume your data was published through there as well.
Yeah, we always tried has been the operative word, to use it when we were doing the work through Ofgem. Obviously not there any longer, but what you encounter is the burden of legacy systems and the ability to do that fluidly, and that became a challenge in of itself. And that's I guess some of my earlier points about often data and digital capabilities being a platform. That means someone has to have done that platform in the first place, because if you turn up with good intentions, it's hard to do it. And sadly, it was very hard to do it. So we found what I would uncomfortably call grey IT solutions to opening up our regulatory progress. By basically, when I was at Ofgem, we stood up an Ofgem hosted public wiki and just wrote the drafts of regulations into there so that it was visible to everyone as we wrote it. And that really helped de-risk and set expectations and let you get feedback on what regulations were going to work and what weren't. And people often forget that qualitative text is data too, and that opening up that data has value.
Stephen, I'm just thinking about the technical capability. You'll have more technical capability than me, having run these things, but I'm not so bad with data as well. But I think of all the people that aren't, do you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think there is a skills gap sometimes? Because I remember thinking with data.gov.uk that came out some time ago now, I think, we just need the data out there, and the conversation around the PDF and unlocking the data and making it XML used to come up. And sorry, this is just a quick anecdote, which hopefully you'll be able to answer. And I remember talking to someone who, anyway, I won't give the anecdote in the interest of time. But I remember I thought was very skilled in sort of data, who didn't really understand what XML was, and that they wouldn't have been able to use it. Now I remember thinking, yeah, I think there is a big divide between people who know how to manipulate data and consume XML, for example, and those that don't. Have you come across that? Or so the big divide still, there's people that still can only digest PDFs.
So I mean, that probably is literally true. I suppose I've quite a few thoughts around this, and they're usually concerns around the pervasive narrative, which is kind of implied in the question. So I'm not convinced that as many people as we think need to be capable of working with the data as it is presented. often people are quite put off by data topics. It's maybe a little bit abstract, and words they haven't thought about before get used, and it's quite off-putting. And actually, I think often that's the fault of technical staff who aren't really talking about basic things in basic terms and try to overcomplicate things. But actually, in addition to that, I have other thoughts as well around the needs. Skills takes me back to economics again, and one of the basic theses of economics is there are supply and demand curves. You can either increase supply or reduce demand, and either which way. Actually, an awful lot of digital and data work suffers, I think, and this is a bit unfair of me, but I'll say it anyway, of engineers being suspicious of things they didn't build themselves. And so things get rebuilt, and the consequence of rebuilding things is that you increase the demand because you have to rebuild everything rather than just do it once. And actually, we don't need as many technical people as we think, if only we would be more effective as a society at reusing solutions, which requires you to make those solutions visible and available, of course, even for sale if you're a private company worried about your IP.
So yeah, so IP is another challenge. But I guess just thinking aloud on that theme around, have you seen people in different, not necessarily move from different domains? Again, this sort of a loaded question, I realise, but my observation is you do get a gathering of certain, let's say, technical people in certain domains, and I don't see it spread across. Have you seen that? And if so, what do you think? What do we do about it? It's people always disappear to the certain sectors. Like, I have a background in mapping. A lot of people disappeared to insurance and finance. For perhaps obvious reasons, and it's hard to get them back. So
yeah, people can disappear. I think I suppose I never quite made the point previously, but part of what I was meant to be saying is that I'm not convinced as many of the jobs that are involved in data and digital work require you to be expert at data. You can contribute to the data world if you're someone who's very good at conducting interviews with people and learning about what their needs and requirements are. We call that user research in the sector. It's a normal agile working concept. But people who are professional user researchers are contributing to data and digital economy, but they're not data professionals per se, or they don't have to be by any stretch. And there are loads of jobs like that. And it's a bit like saying all farmers need to be expert at planting seed, right? There are loads of people who work in the farming industry who aren't. So it's at risk of fixating on the singular task, which, yes, is at the heart of the sector, but it's by no means the majority of the sector. And so there's all sorts of things people can be doing that don't require that. I don't know, but therefore, grouping and such, because there's a lack of, what I would say is a lack of thought and imagination about the types of roles, is that you can end up putting people off, and then you end up getting a narrower group of people, because and that you start losing your diversity and inclusion and so forth.
Yeah, it's a good point. That reminds me of the what were top trumps card, or a skills analysis. I don't know if you saw them, that came out through the Centre of Digital Built Britain, of skills around. This is more focused on digital twin, but again, that did have more diverse roles, which I was pleasantly surprised to see. And but yeah, that often isn't discussed. Things like data analysts and things like this don't get talked about enough. What do you think there is a gap? Again, I know we're talking about, we'll move off, don't worry, skills in a minute, but where have you seen a gap in skills? Do you think there is one? If I had finite money for training, where would I train the upskill people?
So inevitably there are some gaps. I don't want to get the opinion that I don't think there are any areas where it can be. I think we're moving into where there are definitely gaps, and I witness it, is being able to architect what's, I suppose I refer to as data ecosystems. So they're vague words, right? They could mean a lot of things. So what I mean when I talk about a data ecosystem is when you have to start building some kind of exchange or flow of data that goes beyond your own organization across your supply chain to the partner organizations that you work with and beyond. And that is it, like the ability to think about how to integrate with the other companies around you, how to then design the technical solution that sits under the bonnet. That is an area where I don't think that many people have given really robust thought to, and it's definitely growing, and I'm seeing it growing every year, that they're increasingly what is normally the case with information is that it's not just an internal thing for an organization. It almost by definition, information is useful when it starts being exchanged and flowed, and data is just one type of information. So that is where technology is sending us, is it's causing us to integrate our information supply chains digitally. And that requires a lot of architectural design and thought before you can get down to doing the lovely data science and things that people imagine. These are all, architecture is a precursor to putting all that data in the data scientist's hands. Engineering also often gets overlooked a lot. Data science has, I would argue, a degree more glamour about it, in that it's the end point of the data analysis. You get to show off all the lovely insights, but most people who do analysis will tell you that 80% of their time goes on organizing the information and preparing it for analysis before that can begin. And that is the purview of people who do data engineering. And actually, there's a fantastic career to be had in becoming an expert data engineer.
Great, thanks, Stephen. When you said the word ecosystem, that obviously, and that's what it's about, isn't it? There's all these, it's the bigger picture, isn't it? Where people are moving away from that just in my company or in my directorate or in my whatever it is, business unit. Yeah. Then it was company, or organization. People have sort of got there. Now it's cross-organization, this ecosystem. Yeah. So it does bring on other dimensions, sort of like interoperability. I know that's a big topic on its own, but again, maybe for the benefit of people that aren't so familiar with the concepts around interoperability, what have you worked on with that specifically? You could say all of your or your recent career, but what are some of the challenges around it? How are they being met? Like how are we improving interoperability is what I'm getting at, I guess.
Yeah, interoperability is a kind of classic, if you like. Everyone loves to achieve interoperability. It's very, very desirable and covers dozens of topics, and therefore it's not a simple thing that you have just achieved and ticked off. To perhaps help people who aren't so familiar with what it substantively means in practice, to be honest, it can apply in all sorts of ways. A way I've actually quite liked to think about it in the energy sector previously is to make an analogy back to the past. If you go far enough back in time, then when you had all local electricity, let's stick with electricity networks that were growing into a national system, we had to achieve interoperability of electricity. We had to make sure the electricity was all flowing at the same frequency as one another, so that all these different local systems could act as one big system, because you can't combine electricity at different frequencies and get good power results at the end plug socket. Data is no different. We need to do the equivalent of setting the frequency to be the same. And that means that you need to describe, in data's case, it's things like using the same definition of fields of data, using the same fields of data in the first instance, having a certain threshold sort of tests and levels of quality. So, for example, making sure numbers are all numbers in a data column that should be numbers, because it's not always the case. So there's all sorts of, they're really not that riveting details, but they're really important details. They're the pipeworks that make sure that when company A receives information from company B, the machines and computers all say, yep, that's what I was expecting to see, nothing untoward here. And you can get on with what you're supposed to be doing. So the other half of your question was around how have we been making progress around that? Well, I could point to that data best practice guidance again, where it sets the top level expectation, thou shalt interoperate. But that doesn't mean to say the problem is solved. People have to learn what a practical solution to that is. In the energy sector, one of the ways that we tried to tackle that was actually we invited competition, bit of economics in there, invite many ideas and see who's got the best one. And we had a competition that was called Modernizing Energy Data Access, MEDA. And that MEDA competition was won by an organization called Icebreaker One. And the whole competition said, help us deliver solutions to interoperation. In their case, a lot of the focus that they provided, and what I suppose won it for them in the end, is that their service was focused on standardizing things like the legal licensing agreement that you use when you send your data to another organization, because you need to legally be permitted to work with information. That's a part of the interoperation. Also on things like authentication, so that when organization A pings the systems of organization B trusts that indeed it is organization A as stated, which is not a given in the world. And so it's taking away all these very practical things that obviously most people don't want to think about. You just expect it to work. But unfortunately, emerging technologies don't automatically work, and the digital world is still getting through some of the clogged up pipework. So part of what we did was set regulatory expectations so that the direction was clear, invite innovation competitions so that new solutions came forwards, and that's instigated in the energy sector adoption by other organisations around. It then moves on to topics that people perhaps are familiar with around having a standard open data standard for your metadata and such. And there's many different parts to the puzzle of interoperation.
Yeah, thank you for that example. Though you're talking about the automation and workflow again, I think obviously you've been focused on that, and that has come across in what we've been discussing already. But again, just to reflect on that sort of handoff of the transactional flow, like you're talking about digitalizing elements of contracts, or that often gets forgotten in my opinion. Often the conversation is about, well, actually, it's the process. We're enabling the process or a workflow. Have you got any observation on that? I know you just gave an example, but have you got any other examples of where it's been a challenge to convince people actually it's the process of the workflow that is the challenge, and not necessarily the data itself, or where maybe another good example of where there's handoff?
It's definitely implicit in what I've been saying. I don't countenance that at all, that the processes that used to exist were totally not fit for purpose for interoperable data, because they endorsed use whatever standard you like, use your convenient internal standard for your metadata, which blocks things. So it is a process change that we've been achieving. There's another area which is kind of the newer topic for which less progress has been made. So a lot of my focus over recent years was on what I would say is upstream in the supply chain. So the early stages of the supply chain, which typically is away from people's personal data. It's a lot about the physical infrastructure. But I love thinking about different concepts of infrastructure. There's physical, there's digital, and there is metaphysical. And as we move into the realms of things like people's personal data, we move away from physical infrastructure and we start thinking about metaphysical infrastructure of how it is societally agreeable to work with people's personal information. That is an area primed with problems around interoperating people's personal consent information and such. So here's an area where things like the process of developing consent forms when you're asking people for permission to work with their personal data is a very internal task these days. It's not a data ecosystem of using agreed, well thought through and collectively constructive language on the purposes for which you will be processing data as GDPR requires, or the types of processing that you will apply to that person's data once you have consent. So this moves you into a really complicated semantic world, and the semantics have to start tying together with product and service offerings. What is the purpose of me processing the data? What am I giving back to the person who gave me permission? There's probably a product offer or a service offer that they might want to buy. And so that's a very clunky world today. Many organizations deliberately just drop investments because they don't want to have to achieve compliance with personal data requirements, which are important requirements, but they are a severe regulatory burden, and it's burdensome because there's no interoperation.
Thanks, Stephen. I think it'd be a miss because of your background, actually just scratching a bit deeper with the data. What you mentioned, the word semantics, and I was going to ask anyway, how about linked data? So I remember getting excited maybe a decade ago, or linked data and OWL and all this kind of stuff. Does that come up, like semantic web and linked? Not linking, for the benefit of people watching and listening, not you, Stephen, not linking data, but linked data. And I'll put a link about what on earth that is for people. But does that come up? I mean, it must do. You're talking about semantics now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it has a role. I will confess that I spend a lot of my time, as you can imagine, with the kinds of topics I'm talking about. It's really at the top level of how sectors are organized. And so my experience with the topics I tackle is that the solutions are typically relatively unimportant to me, and linked data is one solution to how you achieve good quality semantics. So my philosophy on most tools, or pretty much most tools, all tools, is that They all have a role somewhere, right tool for the job. Don't get ideological or wedded to any one of them. It's very trendy in the data sector to say how terrible Excel is, but I think it has some roles in the world, albeit less roles than it used to. But yeah, links data can help solve some semantic problems, but I don't think the technical solution is going to be the hard bit. I think the problem almost always with data is around the governance of it and agreeing how we will work together when multiple organizations are concerned. And there's usually only 2 or 3 technical solutions on the table. So sure, it has a role, but no, I don't tend to give it a great deal of thought because I consider it mostly incidental, the particular solutions.
I completely agree with you, Touche. There are tools. Technology is a tool to do something. I guess just very briefly, I guess like almost like a yes or no response. Are others using it? Have people been talking about it? I guess that's what I was getting at, like, because I haven't heard anything about it for years now.
But I'm not a specialist on it, but I'm sure it is in some use. Yeah, it's not a speciality of mine.
So I mean, thank you. I wonder if I could just shift gear a little bit. Given that we've been talking about data, and I can't resist, given my background is originally in sort of mapping and visualization. What kind of dashboards visualization? First of all, is mapping or visualization? I know that can mean a lot of things. Is that something that's being used more, and how have you used that in the past? So whether it's map visualization or dashboard visualization to send the message to people, often I think that gets underutilized when there's massive impact in actually visualizing data. Have you got any examples?
So I know that the ODI had a fantastic experience with their open data spectrum, which is another point when I talked about sliding scales earlier. This in a slightly different regard is that sliding scale of, it's again not a binary decision of whether you open or close your data, but here are the different definitions of how our open data might be. So those 2 things sit together nicely because you're kind of asking the question of where can either I reduce the utility of the data but share it with everyone, or I only share it with some people but I retain the utility of the data. And so both of those, they're not mutually exclusive. Actually, both of them are quite valuable. So I think that's a really nice example where visualization worked, but it's the end point of data work, or nearly. It's the bit. The thing I find very interesting is it's the bit that is the transition from computer to human being. Actually, so whilst we don't think of it that way, we're shifting from digital back to analog to consume that information, and you can do anything. The world is your oyster once you've organized the information under the bonnet, which is why I spend most of my time focusing on the behind the scenes, the back end.
Yeah, I guess it's different because in my data, the end game, someone has to know to work backwards. Do you know what I mean? It's a different concept. You're working at scale. Yeah.
And I think most people do have to, yeah, most people's jobs is solve a narrower specific problem. And I was left with a fairly broad challenge to tackle over recent years. So it's changed my focus.
Stephen, just as we're talking about this kind of sector, have you had any involvement in the National Underground Asset Register or the Geospatial Commission, just out of interest?
So I know them. We've talked and exchanged the ideas and things around the work that we've been doing over the years. I would consider myself a kind of, in practical terms, a kind of up the supply chain distant enabler to the kind of work that they're doing. Obviously, NUAR is concerned with across markets. So, but my role has traditionally been mostly from the energy sector. But because I pointed out those regulations earlier, because they set up a mandate that said energy network data is presumed open, then front and center, one of the first customers they've been able to serve is NUAR. And perhaps unlike other sectors, the energy companies are coming forwards knowing they've got a regulatory obligation to be as open as possible, which my high-level understanding is that that's helped lower barriers to NUAR making progress, because it's taken a lot of the challenges around NUAR, I gather, have related to the legalities of data sharing. Well, Ofgem solved the legalities for the energy sector in large part.
Yeah, no, I think it's that enabling governance, which, I mean, obviously you're focused on that. Again, it tends to be individuals I talk to that don't, that's something they don't really understand, that the regulation needs to catch up. So, for example, digital signatures. I know, and I know you've already touched on that, but maybe just to, are there any other examples of the process? Sorry to go back to the process, but again, that's again what often people miss. Are there any other examples of where, for example, the introduction of digital signatures, and I know you gave one example, but just another example, because that honestly, that comes up almost once a week at the moment for me, talking about, well, the regulation or the law isn't catching up with what we could do. There any other examples of, for example, when you put in digital signatures or parametric contracts? That's sort of the example you've got, but have you got any other examples of where digital is enabling workflow?
Yeah. There's you've reminded me of a nice, it's a bit smaller scale than some of these other things, but it's nice and narrow actually. And it's an old piece of work we did. So as well as setting external regulations, I spent a lot of time helping Ofgem develop its own internal systems, data platforms, etc. And one of the challenges is that as a regulator who oversees a whole market, is Ofgem would have to scoop up data from many different organizations. So it's got a nice broad set of organizations because they have to send the data, but it doesn't mean to say all the processes work fluidly, which is down to your question. And what we found was a nice transition was that Ofgem was in a habit of receiving data sets, which were typically in Excel format, for example, and it would be a lot of hard work rooting out the errors and the issues in the data, and then having manual conversations backwards and forwards with the companies that supplied it to get it up, the data quality up to a standard that was usable for the regulatory work. So with a different mindset, when we had a look at the team's work who were doing this, we established repeatable software processing scripts that had specific measures and metrics for the data quality requirements. And what that allowed is we could push those scripts out to, it was the electricity supply companies in question. So we pushed those scripts out to what was then 100 or so supply companies registered in the market, and just say, once your data passes this script with 0 errors, it's good enough for submission. And that allows everyone, not only does it improve the efficiency of the process, but it allows specificity on the part of the people sending the data of what is the definition of good enough, because that was vague and ambiguous prior. So there were problems, both sides of the equation. And that was a really, really nice, neat, small process improvement of codifying the acceptability criteria so that machines could make the decision about whether you've got the data up to standard.
That's a really good example. Thank you. Because again, that data in the example you gave about codifying it, I think that's very difficult for people to be mature enough as an organization.
Yeah. And it feels like a lot of hard work up front because it's a capital investment, but the operating costs are like so low. It's amazing. So as long as you're going to be doing that task a lot of times, it pays dividends.
Yeah, thank you. And I was perhaps going to touch on data quality, so thank you for bringing it up. That does tend just maybe not on data quality, but data as an asset in its own right. Now, I guess we both assume that data has value, but if someone was to ask you directly, this isn't a trick question, just to your opinion, would you say data has an intrinsic value in itself or not?
I mean, this plucks at the physicist in me, I suppose, in that data, I suppose you could say it has value in that it exists the same way every particle in the universe exists, right? That it has potential to be of some value. I like to I get very philosophical at times, so forgive me, but I find that, so people, when they're talking about data, usually have implicit connotations that they're talking about digital data, because analog data is also a thing. And they're talking about lists of information. Often people are biased towards quantitative over qualitative information. But actually, I think I've spoken to you about this previously, actually, Steve, like my voice is data to you right now. It's analog information flowing out of my body. It's quite transient and it will be gone in a moment, except for the fact that you're capturing it into a digital format. And so there's all kinds of data, and sometimes when I talk it's really valuable, and other times I'm on my own and no one's listening. I mean, so it could be of value, it has potential, but it doesn't necessarily have any value. It's all circumstantial, but pretty much everything is data.
So, so, I think that's a very good answer. I think I mean, it depends, right? I agree, because it depends on the decisions. I mean, have you either been involved with or worked with individuals trying to put a metric? I mean, this is fairly topical for me, so I'm selfishly asking here, but I often get asked, is there value, or how do we display the value in that data or that decision or that information? Is that something you've had to do? So there'll be a lot of people, for example, that aren't in a regulator, who they have to get a budget, they have to have a business case to develop systems or code in the example you just gave. So someone is basically saying, what's the value in that data? Why bother capturing it? Why survey? Have you got anything to say about that?
I have a general working philosophy which applies directly here, which is I find that it's usually not worth saying I'm going to go back later and capture the data. So with my philosophy of everything being data, pretty much not everything, but a lot of things, if I wanted to, I could go away after our call and I could sit down and write up my notes, and I'd be creating some analog data, maybe on a piece of paper or something like that. But it's not an activity that's worth doing. It's not a sustainable activity for me to keep on doing every time I have a meeting. What would be better is if I wrote things down whilst we talked and capture it as we go on the fly, the way reporters do with shorthand scripts and so I would, if someone is looking for budgets, they think data has value in their work, I would look for opportunities to integrate it into wider activities that are already taking place, rather than a dedicated activity. Your process, your approach to working should be to integrate data capture on a continuous basis. And then what you need to do is to start having some kind of oversight and governance that learns which data are we actually picking up and using after we captured it, and which data are we not, and being very ready to adapt what you collect in the first place, what data you create a lasting record of.
Thank you, Stephen. The almost verbatim there, part of what you were saying is the ethos of, again, for the benefit of people listening and watching, of the international standard ISO 19650, which we use BIM in the we use BIM but we use BIM as in building information model. But the point being, you capture. So if I'm building a new, again, this is for the benefit of other people, Stephen, if I'm building a new physical infrastructure, whether it be a railway or a electrical infrastructure, have a good think about what data you need and capture it at that point. That's the whole point for the long term, because it's an investment, I think, that a lot of people don't see.
And if you get very advanced, you can start automating the act of capturing data, and you can start abstracting the challenge, and that's really cool. I mean, not every project's suited to that, but if you think you're going to be collecting quite a lot of data, but you're not sure what, then you start automating the process of data capture, and that's brilliant. Then you don't have to worry that the marginal cost is nothing.
I mean, like I say, sort of naturally, I think things like survey, as in measured survey. But have you got? Is there any examples, like, just of what you mean by that, by capturing it? I know it might seem silly, like a form or something, but could you just articulate an example? Because
I've been doing. I mean, I've got a current project where I do it. In fact, I've done it in my last 3 projects. Recently, I've had a spate of doing what the agile working world refers to as discovery work, which maybe not everyone is familiar with, but it's basically the research stage, the beginning of a concept of a piece of work, which is naturally a much less structured stage of work. So most of the data you're collecting, the research data, the interview comments that you receive, the surveys that you take, they tend to be qualitative information with no inherent structure already designed into them. And when I deliver work, and it's the same with colleagues here, but like the working ethos we follow is that you emergently create that structure as you go, and you're constantly iterating through the research to learn what are the right dimensions to use on this occasion, and to start building data models about that research during the conducting of that research. And what you end up with is, I'll still call it semi-structured, it still inevitably boils down to audio bytes and text chunks and so forth. But the really important thing is that you're that you're converting it into, say, delineated lists of information that allow you to very, very discreetly say, here are the actions that we recommend you take, and here are the 10 reasons why we think you should do it, and here's the origin of where those reasons come from. All the things that a data model is always designed to do is to provide you with that audit trail of insights and to allow you to filter and sort through the information efficiently. So I think of that as digitalizing the user research process, and user research is usually for digital systems, so it's the snake eating itself of digitalizing the act of digitalization, for a bit of technical fun, I suppose.
I think yeah, I've almost had my time with you, but that concept around digitizing and digitalizing, I often think about that a lot. Maybe not that specific example, but sort of knowledge management, which is,
yes, it's very much that.
Yeah, semantics of where the difference is. But I think that is the single biggest missed opportunity in a lot of the work I do, where people are capturing data and I say, well, hang on about the people that retire or leave or move to other roles. Have you got anything just maybe to elaborate on the point that you well made there, but just around knowledge management generally? How do we improve it? Is it what you just said, or have you got anything else to say about that?
It takes a lot of discipline. I mean, I obviously spent too much of my life thinking about these sorts of topics, and so as a consequence, I'm trying to be proactive with it. And I think it's an inherent human weakness that we're all a lot more comfortable having a chat about things and less happy when we have to document and write things down, as a rule of thumb, generalizing horribly. So there is at a personal level, there is a really helpful and valuable discipline of getting into that habit of documenting as you go, which is quite burdensome, and it really burns the brain to simultaneously hold a conversation and write down what's happening in the conversation. But if you can do it, it makes your work very valuable, because conversations are transient and people retain 5% of them. But if you can document the right bits of it, you retain 30% of the important stuff. And learning how to make it succinct is another matter. But so I think that helps a lot. Societally, we can continue augmenting machines and computers to start automating the capture of that information in the first instance. And I'm certain AA and natural language processing and the like will be able to automate those tasks for us over time. But right now, it doesn't come easy.
Yeah. I maybe won't go down the rabbit hole because I've had my time with you now, but with machine learning and AI, but I guess briefly, I can't resist, are you working with machine learning, artificial intelligence? Is that something you're involved with?
I use it somewhat. Certainly my colleagues use it extensively. I have put it through its paces, the current commercially available tools, and discovered that they haven't yet got good at the kind of topics that I'm concerned with. So I use it in niche areas, but there are different problem statements. I mean, a lovely example is Zorka is an unusual organization in that it is regulated to deliver software as a medical device. And so my colleagues have written the algorithms that guide robots through spinal surgery on live patients, right? That is a high bar to be met. It can be done. There's some great stuff, but me personally, I'm a different domain.
Stephen, I could talk all day to you, but I've had my time with you now. I thank you so much. There were several references that you made, so I have made a note and I will link to them. So Icebreaker 1, for example, there are some other things that you referred to. Just as I thank you and close, are there any, say, a few websites or online resources that you'd recommend people go to? I know we've covered so many topics, but what are the ones that you like looking at the moment?
So I mentioned a recap of some of the bits earlier. That data best practice guidance is not only useful insights about the round of topics in data, but it also has what we call supplementary information that sits behind it, and that gives you loads of practical techniques and tips. It's a bit of a hard read, sadly. Against everything I've said today, it had to go out in a PDF document in the end, which was upsetting but necessary. So I think that's really good for practitioners who want to learn how to do things. People who've got interest in the energy sector, there's a pair of lovely task forces whose reports are very valuable. One's called the Energy Data Task Force and the other one's called the Energy Digitalization Task Force, of which I've made contributions to the appendices of one of the latter. So if people want to hear more about macro governance, then its appendices are really useful. In other regards, actually, it's not exactly related, but it's probably inspired elements of what I've talked about today. Is I found a lot of value out of another podcast area, this particular one being called Econ Talk, which is a long-running series. And Econ Talk gives some really, using a loose definition of economics, some really interesting insights about all kinds of topics. And I found that quite a valuable resource over the years, as are podcasts about Roman history, which are very informative about the structure of society and that sort of thing. So the history of Rome is another favorite.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll look the links up, and I might have to come back to you if I can't find them. But thank you so much. Like I say, I could talk all day, but I've had my allotted time with you, and I thank you so much, Stephen Steer, the first nuclear physicist that we've had on here as well. So that's that's great for me. I didn't know where we'd go on the topics, but it's really, really pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for your time and insight. So thank you, Stephen Steer.
Yeah, thank you too. Pleasure.